Pulling together thoughts on the topics, not all of which are completely developed, but they just sort of warn you in advance that they sort of jumps from topic to topic, just so you know where I'm going. And I'm just going to dive in, and then we can talk about things. So first section, introduction. In What is Philosophy? Deleuze and Guattari defined philosophy famously as an activity that consists in quote, forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. But this definition of philosophy implies a rather singular analytic of the concept, to borrow Kant's phrase. Deleuze's concept of what a concept is, as it were, differs significantly from previous notions of the concept. One of the problems it poses, and this is one of the primary problems I'd like to address today, lies in the fact that concepts from a Deleuzean perspective have no identity, but only a becoming. This, I think, poses a particular problem in dealing with the status of Deleuze's own concepts, the concepts he creates. And here are some examples. In his preface to the Italian translation of The Logic of Sense, for example, Deleuze himself briefly charts out the becoming of the concept of intensity within his own work. In Difference and Repetition, he says, the concept of intensity was primarily related to the dimension of depth. In Logic of Sense, he says everything changes. The concept of intensity is retained, but it is now related primarily to the dimension of surface. Same concept, but different components. In Anti-Oedipus, the concept enters yet another becoming that is related neither to depth nor surface. Rather, rising and falling intensities are now events that take place on a body without organs. One might add a fourth becoming to Deleuze's own list. In What is Philosophy, the concept of intensity is used to describe the status of the components of concepts themselves, which are determined as intensive rather than extensive, which is one way I think that Deleuze separates himself from, say, Frege, for whom the components of concepts or concepts themselves are extensional and not intentional. In other words, the concept of intensity does not stay the same even within Deleuze's own work. It undergoes internal mutations. The same is true of Deleuze's other concepts as well. The concept of affect, for example, first arises in Deleuze's work on Spinoza, where it designates the passage from one intensity to another in a finite mode, which is then experienced as a joy or a sadness. In A Thousand Plateaus in What is Philosophy, however, the affect is no longer the passage from one lived state to another, but rather has assumed an autonomous status, along with percepts, as a becoming that takes place between two multiplicities. So it's the first set of examples. To this, secondly, one must add the fact that Deleuze's concepts, like intensity or affect, themselves have a long becoming in the history of philosophy, which Deleuze relies on and appropriates, and into which Deleuze's own work on the concept is inserted. The concept of multiplicity, for instance, is first formulated mathematically by Riemann, and beyond that is linked to Kant's concept of the manifold, in a way a better term in English, because in French multiplicity is multifolded, so manifold gives that sense much more clearly in English. So of course Deleuze wrote a book on Leibniz called The Fold, in which he tries to tease out what the P is in multiplicity and complicity and things being implicit. Those are all metaphors of folding. Both Bergson and Husserl pick up on Riemann's work in different ways, and Deleuze first writes about the concept with regard to Bergson's distinction between two types of multiplicity, continuous and discrete multiplicities. But here too, the concept again gets modified within Deleuze's own work. The types of reductions that he analyzes, not only from continuous to discrete multiplicities, but from the problematic to the axiomatic, from the intensive to the extensive, the non-metric to the metric, non-denumerable to the denumerable, rhizomatic to the arborescent, the smooth to the striated, and so on. All these are familiar if you've read Deleuze. While interrelated, are not identical, and each would have to be analyzed on its own account. Indeed, on this score, I think one of the great texts in the history of philosophy is Kant's opening to the Transcendental Dialectic, where he explains why he is going to appropriate Plato's concept of the idea rather than coining his own term, since Plato was dealing with a problematic similar to the one Kant wants to deal with, although Plato had, quote, not sufficiently determined his concept. So Deleuze does the exact same thing when, in Difference and Repetition, he, in turn, takes up Kant's theory of the idea and modifies it in his own manner, claiming that Kant had not pushed to to the limit the imminent ambitions of his own theory of ideas. So one might say that the becoming of concepts within Deleuze's work is simply a continuation of the becoming of concepts within the history of philosophy. Thirdly, then, as a final complication, Deleuze says that even he and Guattari, quote, never did understand the concept of the body without organs in quite the same way, end of quote. I remember reading that and it pissed me off because you're trying to figure out what these things are, and he says, well, both of us thought about it differently. This, however, is not a question of authorial intention. If one considers Deleuze and Guattari's jointly authored books as belonging fully to the trajectory of Deleuze's writings and equally fully to the trajectory of Guattari's writings, one could take Deleuze's comment to imply that even within a work like Anti-Oedipus, the concept of the body without organs has a different sense, a different becoming, depending on whether one reads it in the context of Deleuze's trajectory or Guattari's trajectory. In other words, even within a single work or project, Deleuze and Guattari's concepts do not have an identity that would be reducible to a definition. Indeed, Deleuze insists on this point, and this is a quote from an interview. Working together with Guattari, he said, was never a homogenization, but rather a proliferation, an accumulation of bifurcations. Moreover, if Deleuze entered into becoming Guattari in his jointly authored works, one could say that he did the exact same thing even in his monographs, where he entered into becoming Spinoza or becoming Leibniz and so on, such that even in his solo works, Deleuze's concepts never lose this status of becoming. In this sense, Deleuze's critique of the identity of the self or the ego has as its exact parallel a critique of the identity of concepts. If, quote, experimentation on ourself is our only identity, Deleuze says, then the same is true of concepts. Their only identity lies in experimentation, that is, in their intrinsic variability and mutations. So this is the problem I mainly want to address today, and these are just some examples to get into the problem, the non-identity and becoming of Deleuze's concepts. There's a becoming of concepts not only within the entirety of Deleuze's corpus, but also within each book, and then within each concept, which is extended to and draws from the entire history of philosophy. So that's a statement of the problem. So the second section now, there's 7, philosophy as creation. Now this, I think, is exactly what one would expect, theoretically at least, from a philosopher like Deleuze. If Deleuze's philosophy is a philosophy of difference, then this differential status must be reflected in his own concepts, which cannot have an identity of their own without belying the entire nature of the project. But how then is one to understand this becoming of concepts and Deleuze's definition of philosophy as the creation of concepts? And here I think one could say that Deleuze's definition of philosophy as the creation of concepts has 3 important consequences, or at least 3 aspects that I want to look at quickly here. First, it defines philosophy in terms of an activity that has traditionally been aligned with art and not philosophy, namely the activity of creation. For Deleuze, philosophers are as creative as artists, the difference being that what they create happens to be concepts rather than, say, paintings or sculptures or films or novels. In Deleuze's language, philosophers create concepts, whereas artists create sensible aggregates of percepts or affects. Deleuze's approach to the question, what is philosophy, it seems, to me at least, has the advantage of characterizing philosophy in terms of a well-defined a well-defined occupation or a precise activity, rather than simply an attitude, which is how other definitions do it. For instance, knowing yourself, wondering why there's something rather than nothing, taking nothing to be self-evident, and so on. Those are attitudes, but not necessarily activities. So Deleuze writes at one point, to create concepts is, at the very least, to do something, and not simply to have an attitude. This is why conceptual creations bear the signature of the philosopher who created them, just as works of art bear the signature of the artist. In painting, we speak of Van Gogh's sunflowers or Jasper Johns' flags, just as in philosophy, we speak of Descartes' cogito, or Leibniz's monads, or Nietzsche's will to power, or in medicine, we speak of Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. In all these cases, the proper name refers less to the person than to the work of art, or to the concept, or to the syndrome. In other words, the proper name is used to indicate a non-personal mode of individuation. In other words, not the person themselves, but the individuation of the concept or the syndrome or the work of art. In this sense, I think it would be possible to do a history of philosophy along the precise lines of an art history, that is, in terms of its great products or masterworks. From this point of view, Descartes' cogito and Plato's idea would be the philosophical parallels to Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's Last Judgment, that is, the great philosophical masterpieces signed by their creators. So that's the first point. Second, Deleuze's definition of philosophy as the creation of concept not only implies that philosophers are as creative as artists. More importantly, perhaps, it also implies that artists are as much thinkers as are philosophers. They simply think in terms of percepts and affects rather than concepts. Painters think in terms of lines and colors, just as musicians think in sounds, writers think in words, filmmakers think in images, and so on. The idea that thought is necessarily propositional or representational or linguistic or even conceptual is completely foreign to Deleuze. He writes, quote, "There are other ways of thinking and creating, other modes of ideation that, like scientific thought, do not have to pass through concepts." End of quote. So when a sculptor molds a piece of clay, or a painter applies lines or colors to a canvas, or a filmmaker sets up a shot, there is a process of thought involved. It is simply that that process of thought does not take place in a conceptual medium, nor even through the application of concepts to a sensible medium, that would be Kant. Rather, it is a type of thinking that takes place directly in and through a sensible medium. A third consequence follows from this, that neither of these activities, art or philosophy, has any priority over the other. Creating a concept is neither more difficult nor more abstract than creating new visual, sonorous, or verbal combinations in art. Conversely, it is no easier to read an image, a painting, or a novel than it is to comprehend a concept. Philosophy for Deleuze can never be undertaken independently of art, or for that matter, independently of science, or politics, or medicine, and so on. It always enters into relations of mutual resonance and exchange with these other domains, though for reasons that are always internal to philosophy itself. This is why Deleuze could constantly insist that when he wrote on the arts, or on science, or on medicine, or on psychiatry, he did so as a philosopher, and that his writings in all these domains must be read as works of, as he put it, philosophy, nothing but philosophy in the most traditional sense of that word, end of quote. Thus, in his studies of the arts, Deleuze's aim as a philosopher was to create the concepts that corresponded to the sensible aggregates created by artists or authors. In his book on Francis Bacon, for instance, The Logic of Sensation, Deleuze creates a series of philosophical concepts, each of which, he says, relates to a particular aspect of Francis Bacon's paintings, but which also find a place in what he calls a general logic of sensation. In a similar manner, Deleuze insisted that his two-volume work on cinema should be read as a book of logic, a logic of the cinema, that sets out to isolate certain cinematographic concepts which are specific to cinema, but which can only be formed philosophically. So it is these three rubrics, then, that seem to me to sum up the way Deleuze characterizes the relationship between philosophy and art, or more generally between philosophy and any other domain, and in other words, the act of creation. First, philosophers are as creative as artists. They create concepts. Second, artists and authors are as much thinkers as are philosophers. They simply think in a non-conceptual material or matter. And third, none of these activities has any priority over the other. So a philosopher can create concepts about art, as Deleuze does, just as artists and authors can create in conjunction with philosophical concepts, as for instance in so-called conceptual art, though I don't think uniquely in conceptual art. So the third section now is called Concept Creation and Philosophy. Now, it seems that Deleuze intended this theory of concepts to apply specifically to philosophical concepts, namely the concepts created by philosophers, notably himself, because this is a definition I don't think anyone else would use to define philosophy, rather than to concepts in general, meaning everyday concepts like chairs and pearls or what have you. There's a quote from Deleuze: "What suffices for current ideas does not suffice for vital ideas." That is, ideas that must be created. Deleuze himself makes a similar distinction in his book The Fold, his book on Leibniz, when he writes, quote, "It is strange to deny the existence of the Baroque in the way one denies unicorns or red elephants. For in these cases the concept is given, whereas in the case of the Baroque, it is a question of knowing if one can invent a concept capable or not of giving the Baroque an existence. Irregular pearls exist, but the Baroque has no reason to exist without a concept that forms this very reason." So I'm going to get back to this in a second. In other words, concepts like the Baroque create their corresponding object, since the object does not pre-exist the formation of the concept. As Deleuze and Guattari say in What is Philosophy, the concept posits itself and posits its object at one and the same time. The concept, in short, is self-referential, which is not true of the concepts of ordinary language, which are, to use common parlance, used to denote or refer to already existing objects or classes of objects. But this seems to indicate that philosophy is not, in fact, the only milieu of concept creation. For instance, the puzzle that Heinrich Wölfflin addressed in his Principles of Art History, who's the guy who essentially started what we call the discipline of art history, and some writer Deleuze refers to frequently in his later writings, is the fact, so the problem of Wölfflin was the fact that all the works of art produced during the Baroque period looked like Baroque works of art. But the Baroque as a concept to define this period did not exist. Like the classic period that preceded it, apart from the concepts that we use to define it. I mean, this is a puzzle in art history. Why do all the painters in the Baroque period make Baroque paintings? That's not given in advance, that's something that's created after the fact to define what this Baroque thing is. So this is what Wölfflin did in what he called his art history without names. He attempted to isolate the components of the concepts of classical art and Baroque art, the linear versus the painterly, plane versus recession, a closed form versus an open form, clarity versus the introduction of chiaroscuro, multiplicity versus unity. Though Deleuze breaks with Wölfflin's analysis on many parts, and partly because he himself will insist that the fold is one of the component elements of the Baroque in a way that Wölfflin doesn't emphasize, one can still see in Wölfflin's work in art history a vast effort at concept creation. So there's other places, in other words, where this kind of concept creation takes place. Secondly, Deleuze suggests that a similar concept creation takes place in medicine. If illnesses such as Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, Asperger's syndrome are named after doctors, and not after typical patients. There are some things like Lou Gehrig's disease named after patients, but not usually. It's not because the doctor invented the disease, but rather we say the doctor was able to isolate the disease. He or she distinguished cases that had hitherto been confused by dissociating symptoms that were previously grouped together, juxtaposing them with others that were previously dissociated, and thereby construct an original clinical concept for the disease or the syndrome. The components of the concept are the symptoms, which are the signs of the illness, and the concept becomes the name of a syndrome, which marks the meeting place of these symptoms, the point of their coincidence or convergence. Ian Hacking recently has been doing a lot of work on autism and Asperger's syndrome, saying it's like a mode of existence that's being developed like before our very eyes now, because now all of us think we're somewhat, Asperger-y to some degree. Even more incisively, perhaps, Arnold Davidson, in his well-known work on the emergence of the concept of sexuality, has shown that, strictly speaking, there were no perverts or homosexuals prior to the late 19th century. Why? Precisely because their concepts had not yet been formulated by Krafft-Ebing. In other words, there were pederasts, sodomites, but no homosexuals, because the concept simply had not been invented. Ian Hacking, too, has been doing work on child abuse. There was no child abuse prior to June 1961, when the concept was formulated at a conference of doctors in, I think it's Denver, Colorado, and how things changed with the introduction of this concept. So following Davidson's work, Ian Hacking has shown how the creation of concepts, particularly in the human sciences, can have the effect of making up people, like literally creating phenomena, or making possible new modes of existence that hitherto had not existed. Here too, there was a becoming of concepts. Homosexuality has ceased to be strictly a concept of perversion, except maybe for certain fundamentalists, and there can often be overt political struggles around such concepts. such as the retrieval of once derogatory terms such as queer and so on. My point is simply that concept creation is not necessarily an exclusive concern of philosophy. Though Deleuze sometimes speaks in this manner, he nonetheless writes, quote, "As long as there is a time and a place for creating concepts, the operation that undertakes this will always be called philosophy or will be indistinguishable from philosophy, even if it is called something else." So that's the third section. What I was trying to say, even though Deleuze defines philosophy this way, it seems to be applicable in domains other than philosophy itself. There's another fourth section, which is called vital concepts. I want to get back to this distinction that Deleuze makes. What are vital concepts? And they're linked to this concept of singularities. So fourth section, vital concepts. What is important about concept creation, it seems to me, is less its specific relation to philosophy, even in Deleuze, than the fact that created concepts, in whatever domain they are created, must be understood as singularities in Deleuze's sense, rather than universals. As Deleuze says in Negotiations, quote, "There are two kinds of concepts, universals and singularities." So, what's the difference between a universal concept and a singular concept? Levi-Strauss once made a distinction between two types of propositions. This also Deleuze cites frequently. Only similar things can differ from each other. That's Aristotle's position. Or conversely, only differences can resemble each other. So the first you start with an identity and things differ under that identity. And the second you start with differences and only these different things can resemble each other. From this viewpoint, Deleuze suggests that the concept of a straight line is a universal, whereas the concept of the fold is a singularity. The concept of a straight line is a universal because all straight lines resemble each other, and the concept can be defined axiomatically, as in Euclid. The concept of the fold, by contrast, is a singularity because folds vary. Every fold is different. All folding proceeds by differentiation. No two things are folded in the same way, no two rocks, no two pieces of paper, and there's no general rule saying the same thing will always fold in the same manner. In this sense, there are folds everywhere, but the fold is not a universal. Rather, it is a differentiator, as Deleuze would say, a differential. The concept of the fold is always a singularity, and it can only gain terrain by varying within itself, by bifurcating, by metamorphosing. All folds differ from each other, and they differ from themselves. This is a quote from Deleuze talking about mountains, which are folds. One only has to comprehend mountains, and above all to see and touch mountains, from the viewpoint of their foldings, for them to lose their solidity, and for their millennia to once again become what they are, not permanences, but time in the pure state. End of quote. This then is an initial answer to the problem of the incessant becoming of Deleuze's concepts. The aim of Deleuze's analytic of concepts is to introduce the pure form of time into concepts, in the form of what he calls continuous variation or pure variability. The aim, he says, this is a quote, is not to rediscover the eternal or the universal, but to find the conditions under which something new is produced. Parentheses, creativeness, a term he gets from Whitehead. End of quote. This is why the concept of the fold as a singularity is linked to Levi-Strauss's second proposition. All folds differ, and this difference is primary, but they are secondarily made to resemble each other within the concept of the fold. As Deleuze says elsewhere, quote, "It is not at all a manner of bringing things together under one and the same concept, the universals, but rather of relating each concept to the variables that determine its mutation." This concept as singular. So that's the fourth section. Now, fifth section, which is called the form of the question. Now, to be sure, this analytic of concepts entails a break with the traditional manner of thinking about concepts that has existed since Plato. And I would like to try to indicate the nature of this break under two brief rubrics. First, as Heidegger showed, in Plato, the discovery of the idea or the discovery of the concept corresponded to a certain way of posing questions. And in Plato, this questioning appeared primarily in the form of the question, what is? What is courage? What is piety? What is justice? And so on. Plato wanted to oppose this major form of the question to all other forms of questioning, such as who, which one, how many, how, where, when, in which case, from what point of view, etc., all of which are criticized by Plato as being minor and vulgar questions of opinion that express confused ways of thinking. When Socrates, for instance, asks what is beauty, his opponents almost always seem to answer by citing the one that is beautiful. And Socrates triumphs. One cannot reply to the question, what is beauty? By citing examples of the beautiful, by noting who is beautiful, this young virgin. Just as one cannot answer the question, what is justice? By pointing to when or where justice has happened or where there has been a just action. And one cannot reach the essence of the dyad by explaining how the number 2 is obtained, and so on. To the question, what is beauty? One must not point to beautiful things, which are only beautiful accidentally and according to becoming, precisely, but to beauty itself, which is nothing but beautiful, which is the beautiful in its being and essence. The question, what is, thus presupposes a particular way of thinking that points one in the direction of essence, or the idea. It is for Socrates the question of essence, the only question capable of discovering the concept, which is why philosophers are still obsessed with questions, the definitional question, what is X? This is where Deleuze's work implies a certain reversal of Platonism. For while it is certainly a blunder to cite an example of something beautiful when you're asked what is beauty, it is less certain that the question what is a legitimate and well-posed question, even and above all for discovering essence. That's the first point. Second, Deleuze suggests that the very question what is presupposes an entire pre-philosophical and dogmatic image of thought. This is in the 3rd chapter, I think, of Difference and Repetition, which can be summarized in several interrelated postulates. So this is Deleuze's ideas of a pre-philosophical image of what it means to think. First, it presumes that thinking is the voluntary and natural exercise of a faculty, and that the thinker possesses a natural love or desire for the truth, a philia, so the philosopher as the friend or lover of wisdom who ascends to the idea in dialogue with others through his submission to the what is question. Second, we fall into error, we're diverted from the truth, by external forces that are foreign to the nature of thought and distract the mind from its natural vocation, the body, the senses, the passions. These distract the mind from its natural love for the truth. And therefore, thirdly, what we need in order to think truthfully is a method that will ward off error and bring us back to the truthful nature of thought itself. Now, against this more or less Greek image of thought, Deleuze will oppose the possibility of what he calls a thought without image, where we don't know in advance what it means to think. First, thinking is never the product of a voluntary disposition, but rather the result of forces that act upon us from the outside. We search for truth, we begin to think, in other words, only when we are compelled to do so, when we undergo some sort of violence that compels us to such a search and wrests us from our natural stupor. Second, the negative of thought then is not error, which is a mere empirical fact, but rather those more profound enemies that prevent the genesis of thinking, namely convention, opinion, cliches, and what Deleuze finally calls just stupidity. And finally then, what leads us to the truth is never method, but rather constraint and chance. No method, he says, can determine in advance what compels us to think. It is rather the fortuitousness of an encounter that guarantees the necessity of what it forces us to think. Who is it then that searches for the truth? Deleuze says, following Proust, it's not the friend, despite the terminology of the philosophers, the friend of wisdom. It's not the friend exercising a natural desire for truth in dialogue with others and going and listening to papers, but rather it's the jealous lover under the pressure of his or her beloved's lies and the anguish they inflict upon them. Right? They're forced to search for the truth under the compulsion of this problem they have confronted. The jealous lover is forced to confront a problem whose coordinates then are derived from precisely the questions Plato rejected. What happened, where, when, how, with whom, etc. We could perhaps summarize these two rubrics by considering Deleuze's somewhat surprising claim that he considers himself to be a pure metaphysician. He has little interest in the Heideggerian and Derridian themes of the overcoming of metaphysics. If the old metaphysics is a bad one, he says, then we simply need to construct a new metaphysics. In this sense, he says he considered himself one of the most naive philosophers of his generation. But this, I think, is a slightly feigned move on Deleuze's part, for if one asks him what the nature of his metaphysics is, what the nature of ultimate reality is, which is presumably what metaphysics tries to get at, what the nature of being itself is, his response is, being is a problem. Being always presents itself to us under a problematic form as a series of problematizations. So he doesn't really say what it is, except it's a problem that we need to figure out. Whence the two dense chapters at the heart of difference and repetition. Chapter 4, which is called The Ideal Synthesis of Difference, which analyzes the ideal and intelligible nature of the problems that constitute being itself, or how one thinks of what it means to say being is always problematic. And then chapter 5, called The Asymmetrical Synthesis of the Sensible, which analyzes the way in which these problems are given to us. In other words, under the form of an intensity that gives rise to thought that forces us to think. So that's section 5. Section 6, called Endoconsistency and Exoconsistency, Deleuze's Analytic of Concepts. So forget the technical terms. This is not jumping ahead to his book, What is Philosophy? So the actual analytic, Deleuze's analysis of concepts presented in What is Philosophy, under these two rubrics of endoconsistency and exoconsistency, attempts to bring together, I think, these two complementary aspects of Deleuzean concepts. While they do not have an identity, they must have a consistency. But this consistency must have as its necessary complement the internal variability of the concept. The aim of Deleuze's analytic is to insert into concepts a structure that is problematic, differential, and temporal. For Deleuze, no concept is or ever can be simple. Not only does it refer to other concepts, that's its exoconsistency, it refers to other concepts outside itself, but each concept also has its own internal components, which in turn can themselves be considered as concepts. So that's the endoconsistency of concepts. A concept is therefore always a multiplicity. It is composed of a finite number of distinct, heterogeneous, but nonetheless inseparable components. It's the point of coincidence, condensation, or accumulation of these component elements, which the concept then renders consistent in itself. And this internal consistency, in turn, is defined by the zones of proximity or indiscernibility that it creates between these components. So here's an example. Descartes' concept of the cogito, the I think, therefore I am. The cogito has three components, namely thinking, doubting, and being. I, who doubt in the first meditation, have to think in order to doubt. And because I'm thinking, I must therefore exist. In thinking, I must be an existing being. So there's a movement from doubting to thinking to being. But like a hypertext, such a concept is an open-ended multiplicity that contains the potential for bridges that provide links or crossroads to other concepts. For Descartes, for instance, the idea of infinity is the bridge leading from the concept of the cogito to the concept of God, a new concept that has three components that form the proofs for the existence of God. So, Descartes gets the notion of God's existence by saying, I have the idea of an infinitely perfect being. Since I'm finite and imperfect, that could not have come from me, so therefore there must be this other thing out there, namely God, and I need a concept for it. In turn, then, the third proof for the existence of God, the ontological proof, assures the closure of the concept of God, but it also throws out a new bridge, or branches off to a concept of extended being, or the world, the external reality, insofar as it guarantees the objective truth value of our other clear and distinct ideas. So there's a Deleuzean way of analyzing Descartes here. When Kant then came along and criticized the Cartesian cogito, he did so in the name of a new problematic field. Descartes could not say under what form the I think is capable of determining the I am, and this determinable form is precisely what Kant calls the form of time. So in this way, Kant simply introduces a new component into the Cartesian cogito, which accounts for the fact that concepts possess an internal history, a potential for transmutation into other concepts, which constitutes, in short, the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy, writes Deleuze, means that we evaluate not only the historical novelty of the concepts created by the philosopher, but also the power of their becoming when they pass into one another. It is through this kind of analysis that one can account for the various kinds of conceptual becomings that one finds in Deleuze's work, all those examples with which we began. But rather than analyzing Deleuze's analytic of concepts, which is a whole topic of its own and has been the object of considerable discussion, I would like to conclude by turning to a slightly more obscure and metaphysical topic in Deleuze's work, which concerns the real genesis of concepts, or the real origin of thinking. So this is the seventh and last section of the paper, which is called, strangely, the universal thought flow. Which is a phrase that appears in Deleuze in a couple spots, and which I want to think about here, because I find this actually some of the most interesting and obscure stuff Deleuze writes on this topic. These comments were generated by reading the following passage from one of Deleuze's seminars that he gave on Leibniz, and which are available online. So let me just read this and then make a few comments on it. So this is Deleuze. What is given, quite possibly, one could always call a flow. It is flows that are given. Imagine the universal thought flow as a kind of interior monologue, an inner monologue, the interior monologue of everyone who thinks. A concept is a system of singularities extracted from this thought flow. One can also conceive of a continuous acoustic flow that traverses the world and even encompasses silence. Parentheses. Perhaps that's only an idea, but it matters little if this idea is justified, he says. End of parentheses. A musician is someone who extracts something from this flow. So that's the quote. And I want to make a few remarks about this passage. So first, it posits the existence of a universal flow of thought in the universe. What does Deleuze mean by this? Not clear, but it seems to me to be of a somewhat Spinozistic origin. Just as there is a continuous flow of matter in the universe, of which we ourselves are modifications, so there is a continuous flow of thought in the universe, of which we are likewise modifications. As Spinoza wrote, quote, I maintain that there is in nature an infinite power of thinking, of thought, end of quote. In other words, the thoughts that come and go in our heads, and of which we are neither the origin nor the author, are simply the products of this thought flow, or more precisely, they are the very movement of this universal flow of thought in the universe, a flow that is anonymous, impersonal, and indeterminate. Leibniz had already made this point against Descartes. It is illegitimate, Leibniz said, to say, I think, therefore I am, not because the I am does not follow from the I think, but rather because from the activity of thought, I can never derive an I that's doing the thinking. At best, Descartes can claim there is thinking, or thought has taken place, but he can't say that there's an I doing this thinking. Both Spinoza and Leibniz said that just as there is a mechanism of the body, there is an automatism to thought. We are all spiritual automatons. Both Spinoza and Leibniz appeal to this phrase, and Deleuze picks it up. It is not we who think, it is rather thought that is taking place within us. Similarly, in one of his notebooks, Nietzsche wrote, quote, a thought comes up in me. Where from? How? I simply don't know. It comes independently of my will, usually surrounded and obscured by a mass of feelings, desires, aversions, and also other thoughts. One pulls the thought out of this mass, cleans it up, sets it on its feet, and then see how it stands and how it walks. All of this in an astonishing presto, and yet without any sense of hurry. Just who does all of this? I have no idea. And I am surely more a spectator than I am an originator of this process. End of quote. Second, what then does it mean to say that a concept is a system of singularities extracted from this universal thought flow? To answer this question, we need to consider perhaps what we might call the usual status of this universal thought flow. And Deleuze, as I've already indicated, has a word to describe it: stupidity, bêtise in French. Stupidity, Deleuze writes, is a structure of thought as such. More to the point, to a certain degree, stupidity is the basic structure of the universal thought flow. The thoughts we think, the thoughts that pop into our mind every day, the thoughts that suddenly appear while we are daydreaming or getting distracted listening to a lecture and so forth, are stupid thoughts. Thoughts that have the structure of stupidity. Bêtise is a much better word in French because it's tied to, bête, the animal. So it's not like you're stupid, it's just there's a kind of animality of the thought flow. They are not falsehoods. They are not errors. They are not a tissue of errors. Every one of those thoughts might be completely true, but they are nonetheless stupidities. There is no doubt a certain provocation involved in Deleuze's use of this word, since other philosophers have made the same point while making use of seemingly less offensive terms. Heidegger, for instance, spoke of idle talk or idle chatter, the fact that most of the time the thoughts that pass through our head are simply the thoughts of what they think, the thoughts of das Man. Plato spoke about the reign of the doxa, or the realm of opinion, and he saw the task of philosophy as precisely the attempt to break with the doxa, to extract oneself from opinion. Deleuze's point is exactly the same, or almost exactly the same. The thoughts that pass through our heads, carried along by this universal thought flow, are stupid thoughts, thoughts that are determined often by the imbecilic culture that surrounds us. And is not the aim of marketing and advertising precisely this: to modify the thought flow, to populate it with anonymous thoughts about getting the colors in your laundry brighter or your teeth whiter than white, and so on, so that they're simply there, posited, without you even having to think about it. For Deleuze, the negative of thought, the misadventure that constantly threatens thinking, then, is not error or falsehood, which can always be corrected, but rather stupidity. In fact and in principle, what prevents genuine thinking from ever taking place is nothing other than the flow of opinion, the doxa, the flow of convention, idle talk, idle chatter, the discourse of the day, what they say. This is what occupies our mind and our thought most of the time. Stupidity, then, and not error, is the true threat to thought, the internal threat to thought. It is what prevents new thought from ever taking place. As Heidegger said in a famous line, what is most thought-provoking about our thought-provoking time is the fact that we are not yet thinking. On this score, Deleuze often likes to cite a phrase of Jean-Luc Godard, the French filmmaker, who said in French, pas une image juste, juste une image. Not a just image, rather just an image. What Godard seems to have in mind was this: given the fact that we are constantly besieged by images that are nothing but cliches, the task of a filmmaker is not to create just or moral or uplifting images, but rather simply to create an image tout court. That is, to manage to create an image that is not a cliche. That, in and of itself, Godard said, is enough to create even a single image that is not reducible to the status of a cliche. And the same is true in the realm of thought. How do you create a thought, a concept, that is not reducible to stupidity? Which leads to a third and final question here. Given the reign of stupidity in the realm of thought, and the reign of cliches in the realm of art, and even the reign of psychic cliches in our affective and perceptive lives, what then is the process that constitutes a true act of creation? What exactly does Deleuze mean when he says that, quote, a concept is a system of singularities extracted from the thought flow? Or that a musician is someone who extracts singularities from the continuous acoustic flow that traverses the world? Here again, the key seems to be the concept of the singularity. In mathematics, the singular is distinguished from or opposed to the regular. The singular is precisely that which escapes from the regularity of a rule. It is the production of the new. It's the point where a curve changes direction. More importantly, mathematicians tell us that there are singularities that are remarkable, and there are singular points that are not remarkable, that are ordinary. In this sense, one could say that there are two poles of Deleuze's philosophy, which could be summarized in the phrases, everything is singular, and everything is ordinary. On the one hand, in Deleuze's ontology, every moment, every individual, every event, including this event and me reading this paper to you right now, is absolutely new and singular. Being is difference, it is the production of difference, that is, it is the inexhaustible creation of difference, the constant production of the new, or the incessant genesis of the singular. On the other hand, the ontological condition of difference is that in being produced, singularities tend to become regularized, made ordinary, normalized in Foucault's sense of the term, and it is precisely this reduction of the singular to the ordinary that Deleuze calls the mechanism of capture, the inevitable process of stratification, regularization, normalization, or perhaps what we might call the stupidization in the realm of thought. Like the minute something new is created, it immediately becomes reducible to a cliche, or this is like a singular event here, but on the other hand, it's the most ordinary thing in the world. One more academic reading one more paper in one more context like this, the most ordinary thing, even though it's absolutely singular. And I think Deleuze means that literally, like every event has that structure, both absolutely singular and absolutely ordinary. But this is why Deleuze says the distinction between the singular and the ordinary is much more important in philosophy than the distinction between the true and the false. Since the distinction between the ordinary, what belongs to the rule, or what's regular, what's subordinate to the rule, and the singular, what escapes from the rule, is not always an easy distinction to make. If being produces the singular under conditions that constantly reduce it to the regular or the ordinary, then the task of creation amounts to, on the one hand, a constant and ever-renewed struggle against the reign of cliches and the domain of stupidity, in order to, on the other hand, extract singularities from the thought flow and make them function together in some sort of consistent way so as to produce a new concept or a new work of art or what have you. Like each of us, the philosopher or the artist or the mathematician begins with the multiplicities that have invented him or her as a form subject, living in an actualized world with an organic body, living in a given political order, having learned a certain language, and so forth. But at its highest point, both thinking and writing as activities, or being an artist, and continue down the line, consist in following the abstract movement of what Deleuze calls a line of flight, that extracts variable singularities from these multiplicities of lived experience because they're already there, Deleuze says, even if they've been rendered ordinary, and then makes them function together as variables on an immanent plane of existence. The task of the thinker or the artist or the scientist is to establish non-pre-existent relations between these variables in order to make them function together in a singular and non-homogeneous whole, and thus participate in what Deleuze likes to call the creation of new possibilities of life. For instance, and these are just examples, the invention of new compositions in language through style and syntax, which break with the way our everyday idle chatter uses language. Or, for an artist, the formation of new blocks of sensation through affects and percepts, which break with the reduction of our inner life to perceptual schemata and affective or psychic cliches. Or, in politics and ethics, the production of new modes of existence through intensities and becoming, or even the political constitution of a people through speech acts and fabulation, and at the limit, perhaps, Deleuze says even perhaps, the creation of the world through the production of singularities and events. So I will stop there because that's the end of my 7th section. This paper is called On the Nature of Concepts. It's got 7 sections, I'll just tell you in advance, and it's going in quite a few directions, pulling together thoughts on the topics, not all of which are completely developed, but they just sort of warn you in advance that they sort of jumps from topic to topic, just so you know where I'm going. And I'm just going to dive in, and then we can talk about things. So first section, introduction. In What is Philosophy? Deleuze and Guattari defined philosophy famously as an activity that consists in quote, forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. But this definition of philosophy implies a rather singular analytic of the concept, to borrow Kant's phrase. Deleuze's concept of what a concept is, as it were, differs significantly from previous notions of the concept. One of the problems it poses, and this is one of the primary problems I'd like to address today, lies in the fact that concepts from a Deleuzean perspective have no identity, but only a becoming. This, I think, poses a particular problem in dealing with the status of Deleuze's own concepts, the concepts he creates. And here are some examples. In his preface to the Italian translation of The Logic of Sense, for example, Deleuze himself briefly charts out the becoming of the concept of intensity within his own work. In Difference and Repetition, he says, the concept of intensity was primarily related to the dimension of depth. In Logic of Sense, he says everything changes. The concept of intensity is retained, but it is now related primarily to the dimension of surface. Same concept, a critique of the identity of concepts. If, quote, experimentation on ourself is our only identity, Deleuze says, then the same is true of concepts. Their only identity lies in experimentation, that is, in their intrinsic variability and mutations. So this is the problem I mainly want to address today, and these are just some examples to get into the problem. The non-identity and becoming of Deleuze's concepts. There's a becoming of concepts not only within the entirety of Deleuze's corpus, but also within each book, and then within each concept, which is extended to and draws from the entire history of philosophy. So that's a statement of the problem. So the second section now, there's 7. Philosophy as creation. Now this, I think, is exactly what one would expect, theoretically, at least from a philosopher like Deleuze. If Deleuze's philosophy is a philosophy of difference, then this differential status must be reflected in his own concepts, which cannot have an identity of their own without belying the entire nature of the project. But how then is one to understand this becoming of concepts and Deleuze's definition of philosophy as the creation of concepts? And here I think one could say that Deleuze's definition of philosophy as the creation of concepts has 3 important consequences, or at least 3 aspects that I want to look at quickly here. First, it defines philosophy in terms of an activity that has traditionally been aligned with art and not philosophy, namely the activity of creation. For Deleuze, philosophers are as creative as artists, the difference being that what they create happens to be concepts rather than, say, paintings or within Deleuze's work is simply a continuation of the becoming of concepts within the history of philosophy. Thirdly, then, as a final complication, Deleuze says that even he and Guattari, quote, never did understand the concept of the body without organs in quite the same way, end of quote. I remember reading that and it pissed me off because you're trying to figure out what these things are, and he says, well, both of us thought about it differently. This, however, is not a question of authorial intention. If one considers Deleuze and Guattari's jointly authored books as belonging fully to the trajectory of Deleuze's writings and equally fully to the trajectory of Guattari's writings, one could take Deleuze's comment to imply that even within a work like Anti-Oedipus, the concept of the body without organs has a different sense, a different becoming, depending on whether one reads it in the context of Deleuze's trajectory or Guattari's trajectory. In other words, even within a single work or project, Deleuze and Guattari's concepts do not have an identity that would be reducible to a definition. Indeed, Deleuze insists on this point. This is a quote from an interview. Working together with Guattari, he said, was never a homogenization, but rather a proliferation, an accumulation of bifurcations. Moreover, if Deleuze entered into becoming Guattari in his jointly authored works, one could say that he did the exact same thing even in his monographs, where he entered into becoming Spinoza or becoming Leibniz and so on, such that even in his solo works, Deleuze's concepts never lose this status of becoming. In this sense, Deleuze's critique of the identity of the self or the ego has as its exact parallel, but different components. In Anti-Oedipus, the concept enters yet another becoming that is related neither to depth nor surface. Rather, rising and falling intensities are now events that take place on a body without organs. One might add a fourth becoming to Deleuze's own list. In What is Philosophy, the concept of intensity is used to describe the status of the components of concepts themselves, which are determined as intensive rather than extensive, which is one way I think that Deleuze separates himself from, say, Frege, for whom the components of concepts or concepts themselves are extensional and not intentional. In other words, the concept of intensity does not stay the same even within Deleuze's own work. It undergoes internal mutations. The same is true of Deleuze's other concepts as well. The concept of affect, for example, first arises in Deleuze's work on Spinoza, where it designates the passage from one intensity to another in a finite mode, which is then experienced as a joy or a sadness. In 1,000 Plateaus in What is Philosophy, however, the affect is no longer the passage from one lived state to another, but rather has assumed an autonomous status along with percepts as a becoming that takes place between two multiplicities. So that's the first set of examples. To this, secondly, one must add the fact that Deleuze's concepts, like intensity or affect, themselves have a long becoming in the history of philosophy, which Deleuze relies on and appropriates, and into which Deleuze's own work on the concept is inserted. The concept of multiplicity, for instance, is first formulated mathematically by Riemann, and beyond that is linked to Kant's concept of the manifold, in a way a better term in English, because in French multiplicity is multifolded, so manifold gives that sense much more clearly in English. So of course Deleuze wrote a book on Leibniz called The Fold, in which he tries to tease out what the pli is in multiplicity and complicity and things being implicit. Those are all metaphors of folding. Both Bergson and Husserl pick up on Riemann's work in different ways, and Deleuze first writes about the concept with regard to Bergson's distinction between two types of multiplicity, continuous and discrete multiplicities. But here too, the concept again gets modified within Deleuze's own work. The types of reductions that he analyzes, not only from continuous to discrete multiplicities, but from the problematic to the axiomatic, from the intensive to the extensive, the non-metric to the metric, non-denumerable to the denumerable, rhizomatic to the arborescent, the smooth to the striated, and so on. All these are familiar if you've read Deleuze. While interrelated, are not identical, and each would have to be analyzed on its own account. Indeed, on this score, I think one of the great texts in the history of philosophy is Kant's opening to the Transcendental Dialectic, where he explains why he is going to appropriate Plato's concept of the idea rather than coining his own term, since Plato was dealing with a problematic similar to the one Kant wants to deal with, although Plato had, quote, not sufficiently determined his concept. So Deleuze does the exact same thing when, in Difference and Repetition, he, in turn, takes up Kant's theory of the idea and modifies it in his own manner, claiming that Kant had not pushed to the limit the imminent ambitions of his own theory of ideas. So one might say that the becoming of concepts